And joining us now once again in studio, David Rothkopf, author of Power, Inc., the epic rivalry between big business and government and the reckoning that lies ahead. Hello again.
Hi.
In your book, you write that at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. kind of threw a big victory party in the name of American capitalism. It had won. Describe the popular sentiment at the time.
Well, you know, there was a book in the United States called The End of History, which is, kind of comforting to everybody. You always wanted to know how that was going to turn out. Right? but it said, we've solved all the problems. We've figured out what, the world needs, and it's liberal democracy. And essentially, in parenthesis, that means it needs the American way. And we thought we'd resolve the big tension between sort of public power and private power, because the Soviet Union was all government all the time, and we were leaving it to the markets increasingly, particularly since Ronald Reagan and the Margaret Thatcher and that particular era took in, and our way had won. But the competition wasn't really over. And what happened was that in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism, we saw multiple versions of capitalism emerge around the world. And we went from a competition between communism and capitalism to a competition among different types of capitalism.
Okay, we're going to talk about those different kinds of capitalism. But I want to ask you, you mentioned a conversation in this book that you had with Larry Summers, who was former Treasury Secretary under the Clinton administration, which you were part of, and you asked him if he had changed his way of thinking since that time about free market capitalism. Tell me what he said to you.
Well, I mean, he hadn't really changed his way of thinking a great deal. And in fact, I think part of the problem that the Obama administration has had is that its reaction to this most recent crisis was essentially fumbling around trying to hit the reset button and just figure out how we make things go back to the way that they used to be. Whether it was a conversation with Larry, or there was a conversation I had with Bob Rubin, who was actually Larry's boss and had been Treasury Secretary too. And I went to him and I said, what about this too big to fail issue? How are we going to solve that? And Bob's response was, too big to fail is not a problem. Too big to fail is the system. And what he meant was that if you're a big global corporation, you need a big global bank. And so, we were not going to be able to reverse that. We were not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. And, I think he meant well. I don't think he was trying to defend a particular group, but clearly that kind of growth has had some negative consequences. And clearly the challenge for this generation of political leaders and this generation of citizens is to figure out how to achieve that balance.
When we look at American capitalism, in order for it to be successful, or arguably continue to be successful, or get back on the right track, what key balances does it need to strike?
Well, I think we need to look at the government's role not just in creating opportunity per se. We talk about that a lot, but very often what we mean is creating opportunity for companies to make more money, but creating opportunities for everybody. In the United States right now, if you're a minority and you live in a city, there's a greater than even chance that you're not going to graduate high school. If you don't graduate high school, you're out of the money.
You don't have a shot.
You don't have a shot. If the government pulls back and doesn't fund public education, the United States currently ranks in the 20s or in the 30s in the world in science and math education. We're going to fall further back. People are not going to really have opportunity. If government doesn't fund infrastructure investment, we haven't really invested in our highways and our bridges and other things over the course of the past half century. If we don't do that, investors aren't going to come. So we have to recognize that there is an active role for government to play as a regulator, as a provider of services to those who need services, and as an enabler of the creation of economic growth that benefits all people rather than just a few.
When we talk about the quote unquote demise of the US, big word, but I'm going to use it for a sec, it always seems to be juxtaposed about the great rise of China, and that China's where the game's going, or who's doing quite well. And you write in that book another conversation that you had with I think it was a senior Obama administration official that says, China thinks it won in the 2008 financial crisis. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think he meant, first of all, the United States was wounded by the crisis economically. Secondly, the United States was wounded by the crisis in terms of its global reputation. The reputation of American capitalism, which had been seen as the way to success for the world, was damaged because it was seen as increasingly unequal, as prone to upsets, and as a source of weakening of U.S. national power. Also, I think he meant that the Chinese felt that we were distracted by it, that we were going to spend the next few years cleaning up our messes at home, and that was going to allow them to grow unimpeded, and to have sort of more open lanes down which to go to succeed.
And that's how China won, not just how America lost, I guess was his point in all of that. Let's talk about China, because a prime contender to compete with American capitalism is the Chinese way. Is the Chinese model of capitalism, more functional than the U.S.?
No. China, first of all, China is a big place. China itself is kind of a generalization. You've got 7 provinces with over 100 million people. And when you've got a society with 1.4 billion people in it, some parts work, some parts don't work. As it happens, it's also a transitional society, going from a communist system to a capitalist system, a completely autocratic system, to something where there are some stirrings of democracy, or at least public voice being heard. And so you don't have one path within Chinese capitalism, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That said, there's a lot of competition there. There's a lot of economic vitality there. There's a clear recognition that the government plays a role in enhancing and supporting the competitiveness of Chinese companies that's helping them to compete in the world today. And therefore, a lot of people are looking to them and saying, look, this is the fastest growing major economy in the world. In a decade, it'll be the biggest economy in the world. A lot of upside for big companies is in this economy. What can we do that they're doing? Or what are they doing that's succeeding? And there is in there an important point. As the economic center of gravity in the world moves, the political center of gravity, the intellectual center of gravity follows. It went from Europe to the US. It is now surely going from the US to Asia. Doesn't mean the US and Europe aren't important, but it does mean that Asia will be much more influential over the course of the next decade or two. And I don't just mean China, I mean in Southeast Asia, I mean India. These places, fast-growing, sources of a lot of money, are going to have influence, whether it's because they're the ones writing the checks that determine what a subway system looks like, or what the future of the car looks like, to the fact that they're building universities that are intellectual hotbeds, to the fact that people are looking to them and saying, well, we have to trade with them, we have to think like them, we have to figure out how they work, and people adapt to them.
You mentioned India. I've spent a lot of time in India recently, and it is amazing to see how quickly power is changing there, and how much even the regular guy on the street thinks, that India is such a big player and is going to have more and more influence. They also have a different balance between public and private, and come from a different perspective. Similar to Brazil, you argue. What are the key factors that set that kind of capitalism apart?
Well, I characterize it as democratic development capitalism. Both Brazil and India have vibrant democracies. India is one of the most vibrant democracies in the world, and certainly the largest democracy in the world. But you turn on the TV and there's all these news channels and people debating each other. The Twitterverse in India is incredibly active. It's really remarkable to see, and sort of sometimes hard to figure out what's going on because there's so many voices. But there's developing countries, and so they've got to focus those systems still on bringing people up into the system. That's their priority. It's different from a developed country. So in India, there are 400 million people who live off the power grid. And we just have to, at this point, the goal has to be to get electricity to them. Many of them are far from clean water. Many of them are far from medicine. Many of them are far from good educational system. They have to be brought into that system. Meanwhile, in both countries, you also have very vibrant middle and upper classes that are producing real economic growth. India is creating billionaires at a world-leading clip. Of the top 10 billionaires in the world, I think 4 or 5 of them are Indians. Brazil, now with discovering oil off its coast, with its mineral wealth, with the fact that Brazil is now the leading trading and investment partner of Brazil is China, because Brazil has kind of become the breadbasket of China. These things are driving an enormous amount of economic wealth there. But the challenge in both cases is to have a country that's partially prosperous and partially developing, and where you want to harness the engine of that prosperity without pulling it back, but you need to use some of the benefits of that to bring up everybody else.
I know there are different situations, but these are positive aspects that you're highlighting. I mean, for us in the West, which you say needs to change, what kind of things should we look to possibly emulate from these examples?
Well, different things in different parts of the world. I spoke to the finance minister of Singapore, and I said, what do you see as the government's role? And no one would accuse Singapore of not being a capitalist society, but the government has a much bigger role there. And they say, well, our role is to empower people to seize opportunity, to give them the right education, to create the right infrastructure, to create the right conditions of growth. So they clearly see a bigger role for government, and they're not having the discussion we're having in the United States about pushing government back, shutting it down, getting it out of the picture. Go to Northern Europe. Europe's in turmoil right now, but many of the countries in Northern Europe rank at the top of world lists in terms of quality of life, education, research and development spending, infrastructure spending, and on top of all of that, at the top of lists of fiscal responsibility. So they're able to invest in social fabric without breaking the bank in the way that we have in the US.
You raise Northern Europe, and you have spoken about when you were in the Clinton administration how the model, the Northern European, the Swedish European model, was somewhat of a joke.
It was derided. I remember being in a meeting in the White House and somebody said Europe is a museum. It's all about the past. They have no future. They haven't created a net new job. Well, that was 15, 17 years ago. Since then, we've spent a decade, the first decade in American history, where we actually saw number of total jobs in the US contract. That's never happened. Who's creating jobs? The Germans are creating jobs. The Northern Europeans are creating jobs. We deride, European socialism as being backwards. But when the crisis occurred, our biggest auto company, General Motors, went bankrupt. The United States government had to step in and bail it out because there was no social safety net, and if it failed, would have been a catastrophe. In Sweden, for example, Saab failed, and they didn't step in. They let the market take its course. Why? Because there was a social safety net, and if the company failed, it didn't mean people would be thrown in the streets or not have health care, not be taken care of later in their lives. So who's more capitalist, us or them?
I guess so. You're sort of served up a piece of humble pie, but I mean, beyond you, are there people that are actually still in power that recognize that maybe they got it wrong, that are saying, maybe it wasn't a joke what Sweden did? Are they actually saying, maybe there's something there?
Well, sure. I think, people are recognizing in the wake of the crisis of 2008 and 2009, in the wake of the lack of success that some of the measures that we've taken since then, that we do have to look elsewhere, that we do have to emulate other examples. But, having said that, listen to the political debate in the United States. It's not there yet. It's very simplistic. It's very jingoistic. It's very, let's make America number one again. And personally, I don't think that's the goal. People say, make America number one, and I say, what do you want to be number one at? Do you just want to be the biggest? Or do you want to have the best quality of life, the best school system, the best opportunity? If we were the 5th biggest economy in the world, which we won't be at any time in the next century, but if we're 2nd or 3rd, is that okay? If our people are better off, have better lives, greater security? My sense it is, yes it is. But we have yet to get to that conversation in the U.S.
You talked about going to Singapore and them describing their kind of entrepreneurial capitalism. Similar in Israel as well. But those are much smaller countries, smaller geographically, smaller in all sorts of ways. Would their kind of capitalism be influential beyond what works for them in their own countries?
Well, sure, because whether it's Israel or Singapore or the United Arab Emirates or Chile, these small countries were all developing countries half a century ago. They were in bad shape. They were where a lot of the developed world is. But what they found is, within their small boundaries and within small economies, formulas for lifting people up and creating quality of life, economic vitality, akin to that in the developed world. Now, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, it had to do with resources. Israel didn't have those resources. Israel was a piece of desert that was not prosperous, but brought in scientists and technologists and learned how to grow.
In 65 years.
Right, but they created an agricultural community. They created a leading IT community. I think there are more Israeli companies on the NASDAQ than from any other country in the world. Why? Because there's so many IT companies there. They've created a kind of a vibrant path. Singapore, every 2 years, the Singaporean government does a competitiveness study where they evaluate how Singapore can compete by consulting with government officials, business officials, academics, people from around the world. They create a plan, and then they implement the plan. They reallocate resources to ensure that they're leading in healthcare, they're leading in water technologies, or they're leading in urban planning technologies. So they're being very canny about this. And so even though they're small, we can learn a lot by understanding what has worked for them.
But one of the things that has worked in places like Singapore and the UAE is the political power is arguably quite repressive and restrictive. And I think a lot of people make the argument, that political power comes with economic freedoms and that the two go hand in hand. It seems to me that you're suggesting that that's not always right.
Well, you mentioned the UAE and Singapore, but in Israel, that's not the case. In Israel, which has a similar track record, they've got a vibrant, and in fact, one might argue, very divisive and complicated democracy. In Chile, that's not the case at the moment. There are other countries where that's certainly not the case. So one of the great success stories of economic development of the past half century is South Korea. And South Korea, again, idiosyncratic as a democracy, does have a vibrant democracy. It's not as autocratic as those other two places. So there are different paths forward, and I would certainly never advocate or suggest that the only way to achieve economic growth is through eliminating people's rights. Quite the contrary. But I think when you assign rights to people, you also want to assign checks and balances within the society so that some groups of people don't get too much power.
There are costs to both under-regulation and over-regulation. Of the countries we've talked about, is there one that I know it's not one system for everyone, but is there one that you would point out as an example where you think they've got the balance that's needed a bit more correct than others?
I think the Northern Europeans are doing pretty well. I think they have a good social safety net. They take care of their environment. They invest in education and research and development. They are growing at a decent clip, even with the problems in Southern Europe. They've got democracies that ensure the rights of people. If you're a German corporation above a certain size, you've got labor represented on your board of directors. So they've even got balance built into the corporate governance structures that they've got within society. In the far northern parts of Europe, you've even got a much better representation of women in government and in corporate suites than you've got elsewhere in the world. And I think the treatment of women is one of the areas where global democracies have lagged and continue to lag. So, that's one area. Canada, I think, is a prime example. As we talked about in yesterday's show, that about the right kind of balance between social safety net and functioning democracy, opportunity for big businesses, but also opportunities for average people.
There's another similarity between Canada and those northern European countries. We all both produce really good hockey players, so you got it right on that
and
front
cold.
too. And cold. Okay, well, maybe the cold is helping.
It seems to be, actually.
Seems to me you're suggesting that the best solution to all of this moving forward is a collaboration of all these different models, little pieces from here, little pieces from there. How open do you think the U.S. is to start looking at borrowing instead of emulating just one model?
Not as open as it should be. Still very inward-looking, arrogant, overly confident. Still hope, a lot of people just say, well, if we just go back to the way we did in the 80s, everything will be fine. A lot of people don't recognize how much in the world has changed.
So what's it going to take them to recognize it?
Well, this competition among capitalisms in the world is going to go on whether America wants it to or not. And others are going to grow and gain leverage and gain influence. And the United States, if it doesn't fix its educational system, its infrastructure system, its political system, its regulatory system, it's going to fall behind. And that may gradually persuade people, or there may be another crisis. It may take another crisis for the United States to realize that the inequality that we've got, the dysfunction that we've got, where so much power is concentrated in the hands of so few, is unsustainable.
You said that the U.S. isn't going anywhere. It might slide down to the second or third, but it's still going to be a highly and hugely, probably still the most influential player. But if another model of capitalism does reign supreme, given the political implications for a move like that in the U.S., do you see that happening in the future? Do you see that the U.S. sort of, it's the great empire with the slow demise?
Well, first of all, it's hard to see the U.S. being anything other than the first or second largest economy in the world through this century. The other thing is that the United States has a remarkable capacity for reinventing itself. It's built into the Constitution. At the end of the 19th century, the United States was primarily an agrarian economy. The principal source of energy in that economy was timber. 100 years later, it's the world's leading post-industrial economy, and it's on the verge of a new energy revolution with domestic energy resources. Change is possible. I think this competition among capitalisms is the global marketplace of ideas at work. And sooner or later, people are going to listen and adapt. And over the course of the decades ahead, I think it's possible, and indeed, I actually think it's likely that the United States adapts to this world, addresses its core problems, balances its budget, and remains a leading power throughout this period. The question is, how long is it going to take for us to come to our senses?
Where do you get that faith, though?
Well, because a couple of hundred years of history, we've adapted before, we've grown before, and there are a couple of things that we've got that other countries don't have right now.
Such as?
First, we have that running head start, right? We have a big economy. But secondly, this energy revolution that's taking place in the United States, the shale gas, the tight oil, and so forth, which ties into a revolution taking place here in Canada, can make the United States both energy independent, less involved in places like the Middle East, cleaner in terms of our energy, but also stimulate a huge amount of economic growth. The next phase of growth in manufacturing is high value added manufacturing. That depends on intellectual capital. Intellectual capital is protected in the United States by a system of laws, not in China, not in India. So those countries have a long way to go to catching up to us in terms of creating the right kind of environment for the high-tech, highly evolving industries of tomorrow. We also, right now, have an opportunity to invest in infrastructure in the United States with interest rates being extremely low that could fuel further investment. And finally, we're still the country that you go to when the rest of the world is having a problem. People still invest in the US or they invest in North America because it's seen as isolated from those problems. And whatever the US has done wrong, simultaneously, the Japanese did more wrong. The Southern Europeans seem to be doing more wrong. And the dollar doesn't plummet because others are plummeting faster. So we don't exist and have our problems and opportunities in a vacuum. And that also, I think, works to the U.S. advantage most of the time.
David Rothkopf, this is a very good book, a good warning. We'll see what the reckoning ahead, where it lies. Thank you very much for
Thanks
coming
a
and
lot.
great talk.
No, my pleasure.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.